See, you folks got a chance to take in the Holy Roller Sideshow.
Something tells me you're not a member of the Reverend Hartley's flock.
Now, I remember Hartley when he was a soapbox preacher collecting dollar bills and coffee cans. Since the boy joined the act, he's got himself a Cadillac for every day of the week. Bought for with money that should be used to improve our roads and schools.
People want to believe, you know?
99% of the people in this world are fools. And the rest of us are in great danger of contagion.
Hello, and welcome to Discovering the X-Files, the podcast in which a newbie, that's me, takes a deep dive into the entirety of Chris Carter's creepy universe, as longtime fans escort me on the journey. A journey filled with paranoid conspiracies and monsters of the week. I'm Erix Antoine, and today Daniel and I will be discussing Miracle Man, which originally aired in the US on March 18th, 1994. It was written by Chris Carter and Howard Gordon, and directed by Michael Lang. In this episode, Mulder and Scully look into the case of a faith healer whose patients are beginning to die mysteriously. It seems the healer's ministry may be responsible, or at least covering up a series of murders. We're back into the world of mysticism, religion, and cult worship in this Monster of the Week episode. And after the break, Daniel and I are going to get into it, so stick around.
Apparently my pride and weakness were an invitation to the devil. I muddied the river of my own faith. Now my gift has been corrupted.
So you're saying that you killed those people with a touch?
I've laid my hands on the ill, given them health. I've healed the sick. I've even touched the dying and given them life. God has given me a special gift.
I think there's something missing in your story, Samuel.
You doubt the power of God, ma'am?
No. But I doubt the veracity of your claims.
I want to start off by saying this episode, I thought back to Conduit. I thought back to Conduit because, you know, once again, we have Mulder's obsession with his sister. You know, it's brought to the surface, in a sense. You know, it becomes an element of the episode, an important element of the episode, and it is kind of framed around religious imagery or a religious element. Although in this particular case, it's actually more overt. It's not just a scene of like Mulder sitting in a church. You know, this is actually a big component of the episode is religious faith and Mulder's relationship with that. And the fact that he doesn't have it, and yet he does ultimately start to buy into the mystical aspects that are explored in this story, because Samuel touches a nerve, and a nerve is touched, and his obsession is tapped into. So once again, he's vulnerable to that. It's just, I think it's interesting. I don't know if this was a deliberate thing that they decided that since they were going to explore that again, or when they knew that the episode would have a religious theme, they thought it might be an interesting way to bring back Mulder's obsession again and sort of bake it in there, you know. And you know, I just think it's an interesting element.
I don't think they fully explore it well enough, but it's interesting when you have an episode like this where the event that is taking place is so deeply religious and connected to religion, particularly Christianity. Because on the one hand, you have Mulder, who is disinclined to believe that sort of thing, at least to a point, while also believing in, you know, regular supernatural occurrences or, you know, extraterrestrial life and all kinds of other crazy stuff. On the flip side, you have scientific and practical Scully, who herself is actually a religious person, which is brought up a little bit in the episode, but not really dwelled upon. So it is interesting that on paper you would assume that it might tap into Scully's own beliefs, but it doesn't do that. Instead, it targets Mulder, and of course, brings back up the fact that his sister was taken from him as a child.
When we spoke about Conduit, we talked about how Mulder is either an atheist or an agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I was thinking, he's probably an atheist. But here I'm thinking, actually, no, I think he might be an agnostic. He's certainly open to the possibility of there being some truth to Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And that would make him an agnostic. And he's there reading. You just pointed out, Scully's the religious one. Scully's the one who was baptized Catholic and raised Catholic, and clearly does have religious beliefs. She must believe some of that, at least. And that is kind of interesting, though, to have a skeptic who is religious. It's an interesting kind of almost a contradiction. But in any case, Mulder's the one who's like reading the Bible out loud and all of that stuff. Even in those scenes, Scully's like, look at you reading Scripture.
And it's also interesting, you do have him reading passages from the Bible, but then you also have him being open to the possibility that Samuel actually is healing people. He brings up other X-Files cases, doesn't really mention whether they have religious connotations or not, but talks about psychic healing and stuff like that. But then immediately follows it up with, statements about the electromagnetic and biochemic elements of the body, and maybe Samuel was somehow recharging people's cells to heal themselves, and maybe it's happening that way instead of sort of he's putting his hands on the person and God is touching the person through them. Even though he wants to believe, especially once he starts seeing visions of his sister, he's still trying to come at it from a less religious perspective and more just paranormal science.
What happens is when it becomes a personal thing for him, when he makes that personal connection, or she would say when Samuel makes that personal connection with Mulder, that's when it comes into conflict, because then he starts to, he's still looking at it from the paranormal perspective. Mm-hmm. But I don't think he ever, I agree with you, I don't think he ever embraces the religious aspect of it. I don't believe he ever looks at it like, yes, God is speaking through this kid or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I just think it's interesting that they connect it, that they use a story with a certain religious theme, and once again you have that. Whereas in Conduit, there was a suggestion, because he goes to find peace in a church, which, we argued at the time that was clearly put there for the imagery. Yeah. And there's nothing, and it's almost like it's this on the nose thing, because he's talking about, I want to believe, and it was just like, well, it'll just be cool to have him sitting in a church, crying in a church. And we thought at the time, yeah, he wouldn't do this. So here there's none of that, like he just becomes, he connects with the kid. There's no religious aspect to Mulder's portion of it. It's all about him. It's all introspective. Yeah. And he keeps seeing his sister, kind of like the little Jewish girl in Schindler's List, or more to the point, like Donald Sutherland keeps like spotting his dead daughter on the streets of Venice, and like in Don't Look Now. That's what popped into my head as I was watching the episode. And I think that's my problem with this episode, that ultimately it's a far-fetched story. Mm-hmm. And the way things are revealed, it's not entirely satisfying, because it's also subjective. All of the episode's revelations are subjective. I don't know if you follow my logic.
No, I get it. And the plot, once you strip away Mulder's connections and his interest in it from, the Samantha aspect on a personal level, the plot is really murky and overcomplicated. Of course, it's ultimately revealed that, the people that Samuel was healing were poisoned by, gosh, I can't remember the name of the character.
Leonard
but
Vance.
Leonard Vance. Okay, so Vance
Yes.
was poisoning some of Samuel's. I don't know what would be a good way of putting it.
Samuel's potential miracles, Samuel's clients, Samuel's patients. Let's look at it that way. Right. Leonard Vance was poisoning them. That's what we find out at the end.
Yeah, he was murdering Samuel's patients to get back at him for bringing him back to life in the first place, because he's mad that he is this burnt, disfigured person, and I guess he has spent, I don't know how long, 10 years that way, and he's come to resent it and wishes that he had never been brought back to life in the first place, so he's punishing Samuel for doing that to him.
Right.
So you have that aspect of it. But
Mm-hmm.
then on the flip side, you have the sheriff who's pissed off and thinks he's a fraud. Samuel's a fraud, but there's no further delving into exactly why the sheriff feels that way. And then, of course, the sheriff pays 2 town drunken hooligans to beat Samuel to death in his jail cell. So you have 2 villains whose motives never really cross. They're not working together at all. It's just 2 murderous instances of happenstance, and it never really gels together. Like, if you were doing a whole movie around a plot like this, you could interweave things and make that work a whole lot better. But when you're talking 46 minutes of television, that's way too complicated right off the bat. And then you still have the fact that Samuel was healing people on top of that, and the fact that Mulder is seeing his sister as a result of that on top of that as well.
Right.
It's just way too much.
Yeah, it's overstuffed. And to your point, I mean, it doesn't hang together very well because of what you're saying, because it's almost like they weren't sure what to do. So, I mean, like, it's like let's say they had 2 possible solutions to the mystery, where it was like either Leonard Vance is like the bad guy and he's doing this, he's killing the potential patients because he resents Samuel, etc. Like, that's one possible mystery, or the sheriff, who resents Samuel for whatever reason, is doing everything he can to incriminate him and make sure he goes to jail for this or whatever, and ultimately he has him murdered. So it's like 2 different plots, 2 different conflicts that, you're right, don't come together, and don't even, to the point where it's almost like it feels tacked on, because I thought, until it's revealed otherwise, I just assumed that Leonard Vance had something to do with the drunks that had beaten up Samuel in the cell. I mean, in my head, I didn't know how or why. But I figured if Leonard Vance is the villain, he's revealed to be the villain, and to be honest, that's not even all that surprising, because he basically, he looks like Michael Myers wearing sunglasses. You know what I mean? And I'm referring to Michael Myers from Halloween, and not the actor Michael Myers. I'm referring to the villain of Halloween. Basically, his face looks like Michael Myers' mask. Specifically, it looks like Michael Myers' mask in Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, which I think we can all, it's like the bloated one, the bloated mask. And so, like, and he's got sunglasses on. I guess, he's photosensitive, whatever, that makes sense given what he's suffered. Mm-hmm. But speaking to his motivation, I'm like, okay, fine, I get it. He resents Samuel. All right, but hang on a second. Samuel healed him 10 years before this, or 11 years before this takes place. Let's say, like, this aired in 94. Let's assume it takes place in 94. And so the opening of the episode, the cold open, takes place in 1983. So, okay, Leonard Vance was brought back from the dead by Samuel, and now Leonard Vance is like this figure of he's become essentially the right-hand man for the minister, for Samuel's father. And why did it take this long for him to all of a sudden? Because as I understand that these murders, these deaths are recent. It's not. It hasn't been happening since 1983. It's something that's happened, let's say, in the past few months before the episode begins. So it doesn't. Why wait that long? And it's like we've talked about this in previous episodes, how, or at least I think we have, the whole idea of how good stories need to have like a pregnant moment. And the pregnant moment is sort of like, why is this happening? Like, why? What is motivating these events to happen at this moment and not before or not later? And this episode does not concretely do that. There's no reason why it's taken this long.
Right.
It just did. It took him 10 years of like being paraded around like this icon, like this figure, and essentially being very supportive of the minister and of Samuel, and sort of being very involved in everything, and being very respected in the community, even though, like, we don't even see any inkling that the fact that he still is deformed, he's still disfigured, even though he came back to life. He could heal him in terms of he didn't die from the injuries, but he was not able to make the injuries disappear, so he's still disfigured. Okay, but we don't see any inkling of that being a bad thing,
Yeah, no one treats him poorly at all.
Exactly. Like, it's not like, oh my God, you freak. No, like there's nothing like that. It's like he's respected. He's a respected member of the community. He's looked at as this figure as proof of a miracle, proof that God exists. He's an icon. He basically is this. He always comes out on the stage and he's there. He's an important figure. He's an authority figure as far as the congregation is concerned. So yeah, it's like, it doesn't even make sense. Like, we're not given any. And as I understand it, he's responsible for the locusts coming into the courtroom.
Yeah.
He did that, right? Okay, so again, you have him basically being responsible for everything. You have him being responsible for the murders, and all of that. You can kind of make sense of it ultimately, even though it's not motivated. It's not motivated in a logical way. By the end of the episode, you go, okay, so that's what happened. By the end of it, he's there in the bed like Ebenezer Scrooge, and Samuel comes in as a specter. And again, this is what I'm talking about, subjectivity, because then later on, it's like, oh, we are to understand that he came back from the dead because he walked out of the morgue on his own, according to witnesses. And so that scene that we saw previously, which you could interpret as either Leonard Vance's guilt, getting the better of him,
right,
or you could. That's what I mean. That's what I mean by the subjectivity aspect. That everything is so subjective that in the end you don't even know what is real and what is not real, and maybe that was deliberate, but it makes the episode a little bit frustrating. When you take that element and then you add the whole thing. Oh, and guess what? Yeah, the sheriff's also a bad guy, because the sheriff he's actually the guy who had him killed. And as you said, why? Like, it doesn't really make sense, because unless I missed something, isn't that Samuel tried to heal the sheriff's wife and couldn't, or that he didn't want him to even try? That's the part that I was not clear on.
The preacher, Samuel's father, infers at one point that the sheriff doesn't want Samuel going anywhere near his wife to potentially heal her at all. So the implication, at least from him, is that Samuel would be fully willing to attempt to heal her, but the sheriff just will not have it. We're never given any reason as to why. We're never really given any reason as to why he hates them so much. Like, as a sheriff, I could understand why you would be mad about them potentially grifting off of, your town and your constituents.
Sure.
Just pulling a con job on them, siphoning money out of the community just for, a grandstanding carnival sideshow routine. And then I can understand him getting even madder from that perspective when a couple of people turn up dead. Now the con job has turned deadly. Something needs to be done about this. But to actually go to the point where you willfully ignore the fact that there is evidence that Samuel had nothing to do with the deaths, and then you hire two guys to beat him to death in the jail cell that you own, that's personal. And there's never any motivation given as to why it's personal. And I don't fault the actor playing the sheriff. I can't remember his name at the moment, but he's a recognizable character actor.
Yeah, actually, let me stop you. His name is R.D. Call.
That's right.
I also recognize him, and I agree with you. I thought he was great. I thought he was like the best. I mean, this episode has some great guest actors, just in general. I mean, he's a recognizable character actor. He's been in tons of movies and in minor parts and some bigger parts or whatever. But he's great. He's like terrific. And I will even say, like, they're all good. The minister, he's somebody I don't know, but like at first, just in the very beginning when he first showed up, before I got a good look at him, I thought it was Will Patton. And then like when like throughout the episode, I was like, yeah, whoever this actor is, he's good. But I think Will Patton also would have done just as good a job in that role.
Canadian Will Patton. I feel like, I think R.D. Call, is that the name that you said?
Yeah.
He plays it like he has been given an entire full backstory as to why he hates them so much. And from an acting standpoint, he completely delivers on that front. But narratively, we're never given that answer at all, and we kind of need it if we're going to buy that he would actually hire two people to assassinate Samuel. And like you said, on the flip side, back to Vance, we need the same thing. We're given like a tiny little speech from him at the end, but it's not quite enough to make us understand why after 10, 11 years, some sort of switch flipped in his brain and he decided that what he needed to do was absolutely ruin Samuel and his reputation and potentially get him locked up in prison. Like, it feels like we're missing some crucial information on both counts. And then the fact that you have dueling villains here that they're not working together. So logically, it would maybe seem to point towards them attempting to do a whodunit, but they don't even clue you in that Samuel has nothing to do with the deaths until 25, 30 minutes into the episode. Like, it's past the halfway point at that point.
Yeah, it's almost over.
Yeah, it's like they couldn't decide what they wanted to do, so they tried to do it all at once, and none of it gelled together. And literally the only way it works is because of the performances from all involved.
To some degree, I kind of get it. Like I can understand why this might have happened because I was looking into some behind the scenes information, and so like this episode was written by Howard Gordon. And usually his writing partner is Alex Ganza, so like both of them are like producers on the show. But this episode is actually written by Howard Gordon and Chris Carter. And as I understand that, what happened is that Howard Gordon came to Chris Carter with the story, and he was all like, "So help me out here. I've got this sort of in the works, in progress script, and I'm not really sure how to flesh it out. Why don't you help me out?" And so they sat down in Chris Carter's living room and put a whiteboard up there and sort of outline the episode. So I could almost, it feels like that. It feels almost like he had half of something where he was like, I have this idea so maybe it's this guy and he resents, he resents Samuel, blah, blah, blah. And then Chris Carter's like, no, but how about if the sheriff is like, he hates him and it's like throwing all this stuff at the wall and they're sort of, I don't know, they're drinking lots of scotch and just like coming up with ideas and just like, yeah, and then like smoking cigars. And by the end of it, they have an episode that to them at that moment kind of makes sense. But in the execution, it doesn't really. And the thing is that what you just said about how, R.D. Call is a really good actor and clearly he's got the whole backstory. And what they say about acting is that you're supposed to craft a character. And so maybe there are things that you as an actor will do, like you will create a backstory. That's like your job as an actor to like, you're supposed to flesh out the character. And maybe you sit down with the screenwriter or with the director and you sort of go over details and you try to sort of get into stuff that is going to be all subtext or, where'd this guy come from and that kind of thing, right? And this is stuff that's not going to be on the page. This is stuff that's not going to be there. It's stuff that's internal. But when it comes to character motivation in a story, and when it's something so specific, that stuff has to be on the page. Or, it certainly has to be on the screen because that's, it's one thing to like, oh, my dad used to beat me when I was a kid and so that's why I'm an asshole. And that's something that we never really find out about, but it doesn't really matter. It's just about the actor sort of internalizing something to create the character and to understand why this character behaves a certain way. But if you're talking about motivation, in order for us to understand the story completely, we need to understand why. We need to see where that's coming from because that's key to the story. Otherwise, it just becomes this sort of unmotivated mess. And that is the main defect here, that things don't really hold together because nothing feels properly motivated.
Yeah, I agree. Yep. It feels like instead, well, like you said, instead of Chris Carter actually helping Howard Gordon flesh out what he already had, he just tacked on an extra subplot to fill out the rest of the story, and it didn't
Right.
really help.
Yeah, no, it's like, yeah, right. Howard Gordon had, yeah, you've got 20 minutes of an episode here. We need another 20. No, maybe even more. You've got a half-hour episode here, and we need 15 minutes. So what are we gonna do? Well, how about that? How about we add the whole sheriff thing? Yeah, and so like all of it can be kind of interesting, but it falls apart because of that. And yeah, and apparently they got really into the whole religious imagery thing because they and the television censors had them cut back because like when Samuel is beaten to death in the jail cell, yeah, the whole Christ pose thing.
Yeah.
I think that was more graphic and like more extended maybe.
Yeah, I
And
believe instead of showing the shadow on the wall, they actually showed him being beaten up close, is what the
yeah,
original cut was.
yeah, probably. And they were like, yeah, this is TV, so like we're not gonna go there. This isn't a cable show, just
Rupert Murdoch does not want to hear from the Bible Belt on Monday morning. Please.
yes, that is such a big part of the audience, believe it or not. Yeah, that aspect of it is nicely handled. I think, like apparently all the revival scenes were shot like in one day, and they used tons of extras, and oh, they're good.
Yeah.
They're well done. Like they're energetic. They feel authentic. It feels like a Southern Baptist thing. Even though it was shot somewhere in Canada, with a tent full of Canadian extras, it feels good. It feels like an authentic thing. And I mean, I wouldn't know, but like I've heard stories from my dad. 'Cause my dad, he arrives in the U.S. in the early '70s, late '60s, and so he was a hippie, and he did attend. He spent a lot of time in like upstate New York and places like that, and he had friends who were like hanging out with the Holy Rollers and whatever those people were called. And so he saw a bunch of that stuff, and he's not religious at all, but he went to those places just because he thought that they were like cool, like just like the energy of the place. He just thought that it was a lot of fun. And so he's told me stories, and yeah, they resemble the scenes from this episode.
Yeah, it felt pretty authentic for what it is. And going back to Samuel's resurrection and then visitation with Vance afterwards, that's handled very weird. Of course, it's the X-Files. Of course he resurrected from the dead. I mean, you knew he was going to. That's just the way
Yeah,
this works. But
yeah,
it's handled odd because when you first see him in the room, he's got a little bit of a glowing silhouette around him.
yeah,
Just so
exactly.
they let you know he's not normal anymore.
Right. We
Yeah.
need to see that. We need to see that. We need to know.
Yeah.
Like the fact that he's back from the dead is not enough.
But yeah, I get that. And I get why the little halo outline is around him. But then he disappears from in front of Vance, and then when he appears behind him, the glow is gone. So that's a little odd. And then obviously he can materialize and dematerialize where he wants to. But then you also have the account of the nurse of him just getting up and walking out of the morgue past apparently multiple people.
Yeah.
So did he walk all the way there? Did he transport himself all the way there? Of course, it's the X-Files. You're never really going to get a full explanation at the end. Of course, his body is still missing. Of course, Scully insinuates that maybe the Reverend had the corpse stolen to perpetuate the myth of Samuel as this healing prophet who has now risen from the grave and ascended to the great beyond. That's fine, but it's weird to have the walk out of the morgue story in addition to that, because if you pull that out, you have him visiting Vance killing himself as a result, and then of course the body is missing. But it leaves a cloud of doubt in there as to whether or not Vance actually saw Samuel to begin with. And then if you just have the corpse missing without the stroll on down the hallway out the morgue, there's the question of whether or not he really did leave of his own accord or if his body was stolen to perpetuate the myth. that vagueness right there would seem to fit the tone of the series overall more, instead of just the taking a stroll on past the nursing station on the graveyard shift. It's odd that they include that. Obviously, it's there to piss the sheriff off, but again, we come back to, why is the sheriff so mad to begin with? And we never get that answer. You honestly think that after visiting Vance that Samuel might visit the sheriff as well, but we never get that moment. Vance is given a moment to at least partially explain his hatred. The sheriff never really is, and it feels like they should have had a similar scene there. Even if it wouldn't have ended with the sheriff killing himself, maybe he would have turned himself in the next day. I don't know. It's a little odd.
And in fact, you're right, because when it cuts from the morgue and then the sheriff's going home, I was like, oh, okay, he's going to open the door, and Samuel's going to be there standing over his wife or whatever, and we're going to get that scene, that confrontation, for whatever that's going to mean. Because again, remember, at this point, I had no idea the sheriff had anything to do with Samuel's murder. I assumed that was all Vance. I assumed Vance was the villain of the episode, the only villain of the episode, and I assumed that we were getting the coda now. And it just makes what you're saying makes logical sense. So now the sheriff's going to go home, and he walked out of the morgue like, oh, fuck this, like there's no way like I'm not going to believe any of this horse shit, and he's going home now. Okay, fine, perfect. And he's going to open his door, and there's Samuel glowing once again. And at least we get this kind of coda where now the sheriff also believes. And cut to executive producer Chris Carter. I mean, the thing is, like, that's what I was expecting, but that's not what we get. And to your point about how he's glowing one minute and then he's not glowing, I'm gonna chalk that up to a post-production mistake.
Probably.
I don't think, I think it was intended that he's glowing the whole time, but for whatever reason, for the reverse shot, they forgot to make him glow, I guess. Because otherwise I just think that was just a snafu. But that's the thing, like, that's what I mean by the whole thing's subjective. Because in the end, we are meant to accept that Samuel did have healing hands.
Yes.
Or are we? That's the thing. And that's it's like, did he? And then, I mean, I guess he did, because Leonard Vance was dead, was pronounced dead, and then the little kid touches Leonard Vance in the body bag, and Leonard Vance comes back to life. That's the cold open. So, and that's how it begins. So I guess, yeah, we're meant to accept that that's true, and then we are also meant to accept that he rose from the dead, or did he? And if so, is he a physical being? Is he a specter? Is he? And all of these things are just suggested. And all of these things are subjective. And when I say that, I guess what I mean is also that Mulder and Scully, who are ultimately, they are the audience surrogates, because they are the heroes. They're the ones who are following through on this story. And that's one part, I guess, that's not so satisfying, is that although I guess they do solve the mystery, we don't see them solve the mystery. We as an audience know before they know, we already know that Leonard Vance is the bad guy, because we get the scene of Samuel visiting Leonard Vance and, guilt tripping him. And so okay, right, now we know. And we even know why, even though it doesn't make sense, we kind of know. And then after that, then Mulder and Scully is like, oh yes, we're here to arrest Leonard Vance. And then they tell him the whole thing about the pesticides. And, so we are to understand that they figured that out by tracing the pesticide purchases or whatever and figuring out that it was him. But we don't see that happen. So that's what I mean. It's all subjective, ultimately, because it's like we are told this. And we are told this because there's a scene of Leonard Vance being visited by the ghost or by the zombie or like whatever the fuck of Samuel, who comes and just tells him, why did you betray me? And he's all like, because when you brought me back, I'm still hideous. I'm like, whatever. But the point is that, like, so we get that scene. And so, it's, and then later on we find out about the morgue attendant witnessed him walk out of there. And as you said, yeah, but then later we see that that he's got like Freddy Krueger.
Yeah.
He's got, he doesn't, he doesn't seem to have a physical form. He can materialize, dematerialize. Why would he walk out of the morgue? Why wouldn't he just transport himself from the morgue bed directly to the room? It's all subjective. Did the nurse see him? Is that true? Is the scene with Leonard Vance just a manifestation of his guilt, which would make sense? It would make logical sense that it's basically just a nightmare because, now Samuel is dead and, Leonard Vance, he was trying to incriminate him, but at the same time, there's a part of him that must have appreciated that he came back to life, and so you can buy. And he's somebody he worked with and worked with his father and all of this, so you can buy that there's an element of guilt there. That that he feels guilty, that it's because of what he did that Samuel ended up in a jail cell, and in that jail cell he was beaten to death, and now so he feels responsible. Like he didn't want him to die, and Samuel himself seemed to have believed it. Samuel was believing that he was responsible for these deaths, and so he was going to willingly go to jail. He felt that it was what he deserved. So in Leonard Vance's eyes, like that's punishment enough. I don't think Leonard Vance was what we understand. Like he didn't think it was right that he should die, right? So all of that, plays into now he feels guilty because the guy's dead, and so that's why like that scene could be interpreted as a nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the end of it, it's like, well, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe he did. And so and although like what you said at the what we always say about X-Files is that it never really gives you straight answers.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, in this particular case, I just felt really unsatisfied and frustrated. And I don't know why, really, because as you said, they're always ambiguous. But here, I just felt particularly unsatisfied.
Yeah, I'm fine with the ambiguous endings and the ambiguous conclusions as far as Mulder and Scully go, and whatever their field reports end up saying. But it just really feels like the inclusion of the sheriff subplot, the murder subplot, just really completely derailed everything. Because going back to Vance's speech at the end, he complains about, is this a life? Holding up his, scarred hands and gesturing towards his face and the obvious wig that he has on top of his head. And then he tosses in a little sentence in there. I don't remember the exact wording, but would God bring me back like this? I thought maybe you were a trick of the devil and this was a punishment. That's like a little thing just tossed in there. And I'm just sitting here thinking, if you yank out the sheriff thing and had those two guys be part of Vance's little mob, which we see him lording over at least twice, once in the graveyard and the other time outside the morgue. If you leaned a little bit more in on that little devil comment and, his internalized hatred because of his disfigurement and any other resentment that he might have towards Samuel and his father, you could have worked the narrative so that he maybe talked to sketchier believers into beating Samuel to death because, he turned to sin. He was out drinking and fighting and maybe sleeping with prostitutes, who knows what. And now he's an agent of the devil and must be stopped. Like, all the elements are there for you to just focus solely on Vance as the villain and round him more out as a character, fill out his motivations a little bit more, but still keep your ambiguous ending. But instead, it's just that entire sheriff subplot's just a gigantic monkey wrench tossed right into the gears. It just twists everything up, and it never makes it gel the way it should. On paper, this episode should work if you yanked that out, but it just never comes together.
Yeah, I think you know what? I think you hit it on the head. I think that's why. I think the reason it's not satisfying, it's because it's fine to have the mystical part of it be ambiguous, but at least the part that's not mystical, the
human
actual
element.
Yeah, the human element. There you go, the human element, the solution to the mystery. In other words, these are the villains of the story. These are the people who are really responsible for the deaths and so on. Because that is not solid, then the whole thing kind of just feels like, what did we just watch?
The pain you have regarding a brother or a sister, it's an old pain. It's never been healed. Tell me, I can see it plain as day. It was a sister. You lost a sister quite young. Someone took her away. What else do you see? Strangers. A bright light. You should have come here earlier. Chance I could have healed your pain. I can't help you. Not anymore. My gift is gone.
And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And if you did, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a like, take a minute to write a positive review, and go ahead and spread the word on social media. The podcast is available on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. Look for the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet and check out my film reviews on Letterboxd. You should also check out Daniel Baldwin's website, theschlocketeer.com, and follow him on Twitter at Daniel W. Baldwin. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back in a few days when Daniel and I will be discussing Shapes, which has nothing to do with people dressing up like Michael Myers and everything to do with Native American werewolves. In any case, I hope you'll join us, and until then, let's all remember that the truth is out there. See you next time.